This is an interview with Gary Taubes, an investigative science journalist known for challenging conventional wisdom in nutrition and health. Trained in physics and journalism, he's the author of Good Calories, Bad Calories, and The Case Against Sugar. And he spent decades digging into what he calls the bad science behind mainstream dietary advice. You can read more about Gary Taubes on our website, 6degrees.blog, and our Instagram page, 6degrees away. Thank you and enjoy the interview.
What initially drew you into science journalism, and how did your background in physics influence your approach to investigating nutrition and health?
Okay, so I got into science journalism because I wanted to be a journalist, and I went to journalism school, and I couldn't get any jobs in mainstream journalism that allowed me to stay in New York. Actually, one of my job offers was the Dallas Morning News, and I flew to Dallas and I drove around for a couple of days, and I thought I can't live in Dallas, and I went back to New York where I got a job in science journalism. Um, it was easy for me to get a job in science journalism because I had the physics background and engineering, and so they thought I'd be good at it. And I wanted actually to be an investigative journalist. I had read All the President's Men by Woodward and Bernstein, and that had sort of fired my desire to do investigative journalism. And it turned out, as I was proceeding more so than my science background, just that as I started asking critical questions in some of the stories we were reporting for the science magazine, some of the science seemed a little bit second or third rate. Like weren't really thinking very critically about it. And um, then I went off to do my first book in Geneva. I was a physicist who was about to win the Nobel Prize, had come to Washington, D.C. to give a talk, basically claiming that he was onto the biggest discovery in 40 years in physics, and he just had to turn on his atom smasher and get a little more data. And I asked him if I could live at the laboratory and write about this great discovery. And usually you don't get nobody alerts you to a discovery in advance, so journalists don't have the opportunity to cover these things. He said yes. I went to the laboratory, and it turned out that they had screwed up. They did not have a discovery. They had simply made a mistake. And I spent 9 months at the lab watching them figure out how they had erred. And that sort of fueled my interest in science in general and how hard it is to do good science and how easy it is to do bad science. And once I wrote a book on one episode of bad science, other people would come to me and say, "Oh, if you think that was bad, you should write about this." So suddenly I had sources in the scientific community who were giving me stories, in effect.
You've written extensively about the flaws in mainstream scientific research. What was the pivotal moment that led you to question the conventional wisdom on diet and obesity?
Um, I mean, the pivotal moment. So my second book was on something called cold fusion, which was the great scientific fiasco of the late 20th century, 1989, 1990. It was huge front page news, and it was just really bad science. And my book was called Bad Science. And in doing the research, I thought I had interviewed some of the worst scientists in the world. Um, Clearly, these guys, non-technical terms, were idiots despite having PhDs and being professors at major universities. And in doing this, I thought could pretty much had come to recognize how bad scientists talk, how they write about their data, how they represent their experiments and what they've done. And when I stumbled into the nutrition field, I just I needed a paycheck. I asked my editor for a story I could cover, and he gave me a story on about a new diet study that was coming out in the New England Journal of Medicine. And in the course of doing that, I interviewed a guy who was clearly one of the worst scientists I ever met, ever talked to, despite having written a book called Bad Science. And he took credit for most of our nutritional beliefs that by that point I had grown up with and believed just as much as ever that we should all eat low salt diets, we should all eat low fat diets. And when I got off the phone with him, I literally called up my editor and said, "I'm going to write about salt, I'm going to write about fat, because if this guy was involved in any substantial way, there must be a story there." My training up till then, writing about good and bad science, was that bad scientists never get the right answer. Nature is not that kind. And so, speaking to someone who was clearly didn't have a clue how to do good science, but yet took credit for getting us on these sort of national diet we were on, that many people are still on, suggested to me there was a story there. And I either found what I was looking for and I was wrong, or there was a story there. And that's what I've been doing for the last 27 years.
Hmm. In Good Calories, Bad Calories, you challenge the calorie in, calorie out model of weight gain. How would you summarize your alternative hypothesis for someone new to your work?
Well, so the calorie in, calorie out theory is pretty simple. The idea is you get fat because you eat too much. Okay. So you don't look like you're overweight. So that means you don't eat too much. You've probably got friends in high school who are overweight or obese and they do eat too much. That's the prime central dogma of obesity science. And when you actually start thinking about it in any depth, it doesn't really explain anything. Like everyone who's overweight, you can say they ate too much, and if they don't eat a lot, then you say, well, they didn't exercise enough or they don't expend enough energy. You've always got this sort of balance phenomena you could play with. Um, in the course of doing my research, I came to realize that there was always this alternative hypothesis, which is that overweight and obesity are basically a hormonal phenomena. And it turns out that the hormone insulin is the hormone that dominates sort of fat storage in the body. Insulin, we think of it as a hormone that tells you to burn blood sugar because when it's absent in type 1 diabetes, you have very elevated blood sugar. And in type 2 diabetes, when you're resistant to insulin, you have high blood sugar. So doctors have come to think of it as a hormone that regulates blood sugar, but it does an enormous amount of things in the human body, as all hormones do. And one of the things it does in the process of regulating blood sugar, it also regulates fat storage and the burning of fat for fuel. So it turned out if you go back, as I did, back and back and back through the scientific literature until there's a gap for the Second World War. And before the Second World War, all the meaningful science was done in Germany and Austria. And back then, researchers studying obesity had come to think of it as a sort of hormonal disorder. And the hormone dominating fat storage was insulin, and we secrete insulin in response to the carbohydrates in our diet, primarily. And the type of carbohydrates have changed dramatically over the past 150 years from sort of whole grains to very refined grains dominated by sugar and sugary beverages. So you always have this alternative theory. Basically, it's now known as the carbohydrate insulin model, that the carbohydrate content of the diet stimulates basically insulin dysregulation, and that causes excess fat storage. And if you want to do something about it, you basically avoid eating carbohydrates, and then you're on eating something like a ketogenic diet, which is considered quackery. So the more research I did, the more I moved from sort of hardcore science journalism towards fringe science, and some people think quackery. And I don't know how to deal with that other than to follow my research.
Hmm. So, Why We Get Fat simplifies complex ideas about insulin and carbohydrates. What do you see as the biggest misconceptions people still hold about fat accumulation, which you obviously touched on?
Well, and yeah, I pretty much is the biggest misconception is they think we get fat because we eat too much, or they think that people who get fat eat too much. Sometimes people who get too fat think they eat too much, but they find that they can't eat less enough to prevent themselves from being overweight or obese. If you think of this as so the technical word for hormones or hormonal disorder is endocrine disorder, and nervous system disorders are known as neurological disorders. So neuroendocrine disorder, a disorder of the nervous system working in concert with the endocrine, with hormones, um, you can imagine why people get fat, what the sort of dietary trigger of this phenomena is, why it's so hard to reverse. That one of the interesting aspects of this is like you can maintain a healthy weight eating naturally, eating for the most part to satiety. But I'm sure you have friends in high school who, if they wanted to be a healthy way, would almost have to starve themselves. And then the question becomes, what's the difference between you and them? And that's a question of how they store fat, what they do with what they eat, not how much they eat, what their bodies do with what they eat.
Mhm. So I found myself, so I used to be pretty fat and I've done a lot of stuff. I've been like tracking calories for, I don't know, a few years now, probably.
Yeah.
And I found that your satiety level, I guess, changes dramatically based on how long you've been um I guess not eating that much versus if you're eating a lot. So if you've been eating a lot for the past 6 months, then today you're ready to eat a gigantic amount. Whereas if you've been dieting for 3, 4 months, something like that, then you're just more full after a much shorter amount. Is that because of your stomach size or is that a more hormonal?
That is going to be a little of both.
Mm.
But the question you've got to be asking is less about sort of short-term effects. So, for instance, if I reduce your weight by 20 pounds by having you on a calorie restricted diet, you will be able to gain those 20 pounds back very easily without increasing your calories consumed very much. Because your body is trying to gain those 20 pounds back if you don't change the composition of what you eat. Again, if I'm right, for all we know, I'm, a quack. That's always a possibility. Um, so there are a lot of ideas about fat storage, hunger, satiety, obesity, how much you eat, how much you will eat that have been um, determined based on very short-term studies. This is when I talk about nutrition science being a pseudoscience or just a bad science. For instance, somebody will do research where they'll overfeed you at breakfast. They'll sort of force feed a lot of food, and then they'll look at how much you eat at lunch. And from that, they'll make some conclusion about how hunger and satiety and overfeeding influence obesity, which is a phenomenon that happens over years to decades. And so if you want to study it, if you want to understand a phenomenon that happens very slowly over, years to decades, you have to study very small increments of fat accumulation that occur daily and then do it for months. It's very complicated stuff. It's very hard science to do because you have to do it in humans for the most part. And there's a reason why the science is so bad, but those kinds of observations, um, I don't know, maybe your stomach shrank. If I didn't eat for 2 months, and then suddenly you said I could eat as much as I want, I would eat an enormous amount of food. I would probably feel sick. I don't know if I could eat more or less food than I could if I just sat down today after after eating regularly for the same 2 months. Those are the kind of issues that you have to compare. But even then, you only find out what happens in that short transition from underfeeding to it's called ad libitum feeding.
Mm.
Complicated.
So, this is a very trendy question, I guess, but what do you think about the rise of various GLP-1s like Ozempic and Mounjaro, things like that?
Well, they seem to be remarkable drugs. Again, there's several issues. So on one level, obesity is an intractable disorder. People who become obese tend to stay obese. Everyone agrees with that. And then the question is, how do you treat them? If I'm right and my people like me are right, then one reason why it's intractable is because we keep thinking of it as an energy balance disorder, eating too much instead of a carbohydrate insulin disorder. And if you want to fix the disorder of eating carbohydrates, and you have to do it by abstaining from carbohydrates. So it's a different type of therapy. And when people approach it that way, they tend to solve the problem. It ceases to be an intractable disorder. It's possible, though, for an enormous amount of people, whatever they do to their diet isn't going to change their weight much. And for them, GLP-1 drugs seem to be miracle drugs, wonder drugs. What worries me is that they're drugs you then have to take for the rest of your life. If you're 60 and you're taking them until you're 90, maybe that's not a big deal. But if you start at 16 and you're taking them for 70 years, or even 20 years, we really have no idea what the long-term effects are. They're very powerful drugs. They literally change the shape of your body. And they probably do a lot more than the medical establishment thinks of them doing. And any kind of long-term drug therapy worries me.
Hmm.
And we have a lot of examples, and particularly with uh, drugs, benzodiazepines for anxiety and depression and other, where long-term drug use creates serious problems. Um, and yet, that's what we're looking at with the GLP-1s. The idea is if you want them to continue working, you have to stay on them for life. And it's expensive, and we have no idea what kind of long-term problems might come up. In the short term, they appear to be very beneficial, but in the long term, we just don't know.
Mhm. So, in the case against sugar, you liken sugar to tobacco in terms of public health impact. What evidence do you find most compelling for treating sugar as an addictive toxin?
Um, okay, is addictive. I don't really know. I mean, the evidence that it's addictive is if you're a parent or you have a sweet tooth, it's pretty clear that this compound is screwing with your brain in a way that makes you want to repeat using it, no matter how bad you might think it is for you. The actual scientific evidence that it's addictive is pretty bad. We know it's very addictive for rats and mice. Like there are these studies that were done where you could get a rat hooked on heroin and then offered a choice between sugar water or heroin, and it will choose the sugar water over the heroin. Those experiments have never been done in humans for the obvious reasons. The evidence that it's a toxin, I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of laboratory evidence in rodents. Um, the basis of it is this observation that was done mostly by British physicians. The British, prior to World War II, they had the British Empire, they had colonial and missionary hospitals all around the world, and they would administer to different populations of people all around the world. And when those people started eating Western food, which was back then with sugar and white flour, they started manifesting obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and a host of other chronic conditions that associate with obesity and diabetes and heart disease. And by the 1960s, the conclusion was that sugar and flour were the most likely triggers. So comparing it to cigarettes, the first easily inhalable cigarette was the American blended tobacco came in, I forget the exact date, around 1912. Until then, cigarettes were as hard to inhale as pipes were or cigars, and so they weren't that popular. But as soon as they figured out how to make the tobacco less biting in your throat, and it was easier to draw it into your lungs, which allowed the nicotine to get into your lungs deeper, which allowed you to become more addicted to the nicotine, cigarettes took off in popularity, and it coincided with an epidemic of lung cancer. So lung cancer was a very rare disease before the first American blended cigarettes. Within 10 years of the cigarettes coming on, you could see lung cancer rates climbing upward, and you could see diabetes and obesity rates climbing upward after the appearance of sugar and white flour. And then in my book, The Case Against Sugar, I tied that also to research that was done from the 1960s onward, linking basically sugar consumption to, again, obesity, diabetes, and related disorders. But the primary evidence is take any population, regardless of what they're eating. They could be the Inuit living on, seals and whale meat and caribou, or they could be uh, Southeast Asians living on rice and wheat and fish, or they could be African pastoralists living on the blood and meat from the cattle they herd, and you add to their diet sugar and white flour, and they become obese and diabetic, and heart disease appears, and hypertension appears, and all the rest.
Mhm. Yeah, in 6 Degrees Spirit, I spoke to Michael Moss last month, who you might be familiar with
I
from
know.
Salt, Sugar, Fat, he wrote. And he was telling me about how sugar could be as addictive as any other drug. And he said something similar to your heroin thing. And that's something that I hadn't even considered before hearing him talk about it, is you don't really think of sugar or other things like that as something that's addictive so much as something that you're actively choosing to eat over something else.
Well, again, it's if it's where it helps to be older and have had addictions. Um, and again, Michael has a less, let's say, our approach to this. Michael's more of a journalist. I approach this a little more scientifically, probably because I had the experience to write books about science that not so much my physics degree in college, but the fact that the people who were influencing me while writing those books were very good scientists who helped me understand how to look at evidence. But, um, I can, again, if you I've met people who say they experience this, but for instance, if I used to be a cigarette smoker, and a lot of my understanding of addiction is filtered through my own experience as a smoker, and it took me 20 years to quit, and so I don't think anyone should start. I started when I got to graduate school because I was unhappy, and it took me literally 20 years to get to the point that I quit. And I still chew Nicorettes on occasion. Um, when I write because nicotine's a terrific drug for focusing, and I'm still addicted. But you quit smoking, you don't smoke for a day and you are miserable. All you could think about is cravings. For the cigarettes, you can go a day without. I have a terrible sweet tooth, but I could go a day without anything sweet and I don't crave it. But if I am sitting next to someone who is eating, so if I go out to dinner, like tonight I'm going to dinner with my wife, it's our anniversary, or yesterday was our anniversary. Um, and she's going to get dessert and I'm not. And she's going to take one bite of the dessert and push it aside because she doesn't have a sweet tooth. And I'm going to do nothing but think about eating that dessert until I can get it removed from the table. And if the waitress doesn't come and remove it from the table, I'm going to eat it. Um, and regret it tomorrow morning. The it's a, it I believe it is addictive. Like I said, the science is ambiguous. There really is very little science on this on humans. Um, it's addictive, I think, in a very different way than other drugs of abuse are. Okay, and that's something that maybe more similar to alcohol than nicotine or other drugs. And But that's based purely on my own observations and research, not on anything I learned of any substance from the hundreds of interviews I've done with people on these subjects over the years. You will find people saying it's addictive, but if you actually look for the studies, it's like, well, it is for rats. And again, if you're a parent and you've got a kid with a sweet tooth, you don't need any studies
Mhm.
to tell you whether or not it's screwing up your kid's brain. Um, More than clear. Sometimes you just don't need science. Like you don't need a randomized controlled trial to tell you what the reality of what you're dealing with is.
Mhm. So, in terms of your scientific approach and your ideas, what's something actionable? Like, for example, what are you going to order tonight at your anniversary dinner?
Well, my wife's going to get pasta because we always go to an Italian restaurant. Like I said, she's going to get dessert, and I'm going to probably order. Well, they have a duck at this restaurant I like and steak that I like, and I'll ask them to hold the starch and give me extra vegetables because I don't tend to eat starches. And then I'll have a bite of my wife's pasta, and then I will crave that for the rest of the meal until we get to dessert when I'll crave the dessert.
Mhm. But so generally, would you recommend a carb-free diet or keto diet, something like that? What would the and also what would the macro breakdown be? I feel as though if you eat lots of meat and vegetables don't have all too many calories and meat also, I mean, it is somewhat calorically dense, but it's hard to just go crazy and have I don't know, even just the amount of calories you need to not lose weight in just meat or chicken or something like that. So what would that breakdown look like, and what would you do carb-free?
Well, it's one way I don't really think about it. So I think as soon as you start thinking about things like energy density, that's kind of conventional wisdom approach to looking at diet. So you're thinking, how many calories I'm eating? Can I keep the calories low? If I'm eating green vegetables, the calories are relatively low, but the carbohydrates are actually relatively low as well. Um, the way I think of it is, first of all, we're all different. Okay, so the world is clearly full of people who can eat carbohydrates as much as they want. They could eat rice and potatoes. I used to be one of those people. Many people who have trouble with their weight as they get older were completely normal when they were younger. Um, so the question, and one of the assumptions when you talk about what things get, people tend to get wrong thinking about nutrition. One of the things they get wrong is we tend to think, like, if you're lean and you eat a relatively healthy diet, you think, I'm lean, I eat a relatively healthy diet. I clearly don't eat too much because I'm lean. So if everybody else ate just like I did, they would be lean also. And then you write a diet book, or you're Michael Pollan, you write a book that says everyone should eat food, not too much, mostly plants, and that'll solve the problem. In my world, people who think like me, those of us who gain weight easily are different than those who don't. So those who don't can metabolize carbohydrates. And then remember that one way to think about it is it's not about how much you eat, it's about what your body does with what you eat. And then the technical term there is called fuel partitioning. So if your body partitions the fuel you eat into energy, then you tend to be lean, you have a lot of energy, you might run marathons or go bike racing on your days off. If your body partitions fuel into fat, if it tends to want to store the food as fat, then you get heavier, then you become an offensive lineman in football instead of you know, a receiver or a cornerback. What your body does with the food you're eating determines whether or not you're gaining fat or having energy. And like I said, the hormone insulin dominates this process. So for those of us who get fat easily, that's because of the carbohydrates we eat. And if we're right, then the ideal is we abstain from carbohydrates, carbohydrate-rich foods. Again, green vegetables are not carbohydrate rich. So then you're eating something that looks like a ketogenic diet.
Mhm.
When I was younger, it was called Atkins when I first started doing this research. Atkins is still around, the Atkins diet. Um, if you're relatively lean already, then the idea is just eat healthier carbohydrates. So now you can get by with whole grains instead of refined grains. I think everyone should avoid sugar because I do think it's toxic, even though I don't have the evidence to prove that. But like the first thing I would tell anyone to do is to avoid sugar. Um, but then again, depending on how heavy you tend to be, tells you how completely you have to abstain from the sort of carbohydrate-rich foods in the diet. If you have a friend who weighs 300 pounds in high school or 250 pounds, my guess would be that they could weigh 170 pounds if they ate a ketogenic diet. But if they compromise, they might weigh 240 instead of 250. It wouldn't be worth it. It's sort of, and for somebody who's lean anyway, then just do what you're doing, just do it healthier because it's clearly working. And if you do it healthier, if you eat healthier carbs, less refined, avoiding sugar, then you might never get to the point where you start gaining weight easily and have to restrict more completely. I feel like if I had eaten a healthy diet when I was young, meaning no sugar, no crap cereals, and um, then I probably never would have gotten to the point that I have to eat the way I do now to maintain a healthy weight.
Hmm. So, you're a fan of red meat and sodium, things like that, which are often seen as, oh, your cholesterol, you're gonna have a heart attack. Um, Why do you think that's been so? I mean, within nutrition, as you spoke of, where there's a lot of misconceptions and changing theories, it seems as though things like sodium and red meat, one day it's so great. One day Peter Attia says, eat all the protein you can. Another day, no protein, no sodium, you're gonna have a heart attack, something like that. Why do you think it's been so mixed up? And then also, what are your views on sodium and red meat, things like that, in terms of
Okay, well,
cholesterol?
sodium, people eat like I do. I mean, again, this my very first investigation, which I did for the journal Science, was on the sodium story, salt and high blood pressure. It turns out the evidence for it is pretty bad. So when you consume sodium, your body absorbs water to keep the fluid volume in your cells the same. Basically, keep the sodium level in the cellular fluids the same. That'll tend to raise your blood pressure in the short term, but the long-term cause of hypertension, it was just an interesting hypothesis that was tested and never passed the tests. But one of the problems in nutrition science is people tend to believe their hypotheses. They get invested in the hypotheses, and then when the hypothesis is tested in an experiment and fails to be confirmed, they blame the experiment rather than the hypothesis. That's sort of classic bad science. They might be right, by the way, but it's still classic bad science to think like that. What you have to do is do a better experiment, and then if that experiment confirms the hypothesis, you still have to replicate the experiment or do yet another one because you don't know if the replication you don't know if the confirmation was correct. Science is difficult. So it turns out that carbohydrates and insulin also have a profound effect on blood pressure. And now we get into a whole world of science involving this condition called metabolic syndrome, which is basically something called insulin resistance, which is chronically high levels of insulin. And if your insulin is chronically elevated, that will drive up your blood pressure because of many ways in which insulin does that. And if you want to lower your blood pressure, you have to lower your insulin. And the way you do that is by not eating carbohydrates. So now the salt becomes irrelevant because you're controlling your blood sugar through the macronutrient content, basically abstaining from carbohydrates. When you do that, you lose a lot of body water, which with it goes electrolytes, and now you have to actually actively eat salt to replace it, which is what most organisms have high salt content because they need to get sodium into their system. Um, the red meat story is just beginning in the 1960s, sort of vegetarian element in the nutrition science community started arguing that red meat was a primate. Well, first of all, it was environmentally disastrous because it takes so many. You could feed one cow requires feeding a village worth of carbohydrates to people. I don't know if I have that right, but the there became this very strong vegetarian argument for a healthy diet, even beginning in the 1960s. The Seventh-day Adventists, a religious group, were involved. And what happened was by the 1960s, 1970s, there were people pushing this idea that red meat was bad for the environment, unsustainable, and so bad for us as well. It was linked to colon cancer, although those studies never panned out. And what happened was you got a world of people who believed that red meat was harmful without the evidence. Red and processed meat, particularly. Lower socioeconomic groups tended to rely on processed meats and cheap meats at fast food restaurants for their proteins. So when you looked in these large environmental uh, they're called cohort studies, where you take, say, 50,000 people around the country and you look at what they eat and you compare it to what diseases they end up getting. You found that the people who had high levels of disease were people who tended to eat more meat and more processed meat. Okay, and this is, you've heard the phrase, association is not causality. Okay, so you have an association between the type of people who ate a lot of meat, the socioeconomic status of the people who tended to eat a lot of meat, and bad health. And that became this idea that the meat itself is unhealthy. Um, the reality is, it was never, that's a hypothesis that experiment after experiment failed to confirm. Clinical experiments in medicine are clinical trials. And there's a lot of arguments for why meat in the diet is good for you. It happens to be a very excellent source of virtually every vitamin other than vitamin C. It's a major source of several vitamins. Animal proteins are sort of easier for the body to use than vegetable proteins. There's a lot of reasons why you would argue that meat is beneficial. But as soon as we got this idea and sort of the conventional thinking that less meat is good. Michael Pollan's, remember his mantras, eat food, mostly plants, not too much. As soon as this mostly plant idea sort of arose, then healthy people tended to eat mostly plants. And when the studies looked at what healthy people tended to do, they found they ate mostly plants, and then they said, they must be healthy because they eat mostly plants, as opposed to the alternative, which is they ate mostly plants because they were healthy and health conscious, and that's what they were being told to do by nutrition experts. So in my world, again, if you want to avoid carbohydrate-rich foods, the easiest way to do it is to eat animal products. Probably not great for the animals, but it might be the healthiest way for people like me to eat. And so it's not that I like, I mean, I do enjoy, I don't know even how to phrase this without, I like eating meat. It makes up a large part of my diet, but I also have a paradigm of health that suggests that I'm healthier for doing it. I disagree with Peter Attia, with whom I worked for 5 years, that maximizing your protein intake is anything you should be thinking about. And we have a lot of different, we used to have the same thoughts on nutrition, but now we don't. But I wouldn't advocate for eating meat because you need to get in some enormous amount of protein in the diet. It's just animals. Another way to think about another saying that comes from a fellow named Eric Westman, who did a lot of good research in this area. A lot of the original research, Eric said, eat what you are, not you are what you eat, but eat what you are. So we aren't carbohydrates. We are fat and protein. So we should eat fat and protein, and that would be the healthiest thing to do. And it's inanely simple, and it makes sense, and it agrees with my other research. So,
Mhm. So you've criticized the role of institutions like the USDA in shaping dietary guidelines. What reforms do you believe are necessary to improve nutrition policy? But I'd like to add something to this question as well. What do you think of RFK's Make America Healthy Again in this whole new movement?
Well, okay, let's start with RFK just to get him out of the way. Remember, I told you I went into this business because I thought I could recognize a good scientist from a bad scientist.
Mhm.
Okay. RFK is, to me, a bad scientist. I mean, when he tries to be a scientist, he has all the traits of a terrible scientist. I disagree with him on most things. Okay. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people in his world who think about nutrition the way I do. So another message. So when it comes to nutrition, I think he's probably right because he's getting advice from people in my world, many of whom started thinking the way I do because they read my books. Um, the vaccine stuff, a lot of the more often than not, when I read whatever RFK Jr. said that day, I find myself cringing and thinking, how is this person running health policy in America? Problem with institutions like the USDA and health organizations like the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association. So in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, the science of what constituted a healthy diet was in flux. The evidence was ambiguous. We didn't know what the truth was, and we had competing hypotheses. They were very controversial ideas, like the idea that we should eat low-fat diets or eat low-saturated fat diets had not been rigorously tested. And when they were tested, they tended to fail the tests. Like this is what I was talking about. Then you have institutions like the American Heart Association first, and then the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the American Diabetes Association who come in and say, it's our job to give dietary advice. So we may not know what the truth is, but we should tell people what to eat as best as we understand it today. So you take a controversial subject in which there's, let's say, for the most part, two competing ideas. You decide that one of them is likely to be right because more people believe that than the other one. And then you communicate that idea as though it's right because you want to get people to eat to change their diets. You don't want to say, well, we think saturated fat might be bad for you. We're really not sure, but you should probably eat less of it because then no one's going to take your advice. They're going to say, wait, I should go my whole life without eating butter or putting cream in my coffee because you think it might be bad for you. For me. So you tell people, you take this unproven idea, you promote it as though it's been demonstratively proven, and then you assume that somehow if the evidence changes, you will change your advice. But what we now know is that that doesn't happen with institutions and organizations. So they take a science in flux in which nobody knows what the truth is. They pick the truth and then they invested in it as though it were demonstratively proven. And when the experiments failed to confirm it, they basically said, well, we must have done the experiments wrong because we've been pushing this for so long, it must be true. In science, it's called falling in love with your hypothesis, but when an institution does it, there's almost no going back. So, from my perspective, these institutions did more harm than good. Their hearts were in the right place. They wanted to prevent chronic disease, but they did it by interceding in the scientific process and locking the science into one perspective that happened to be wrong, assuming I'm right.
Mhm.
And then then a journalist comes along and says, well, you guys are wrong. Who are you going to believe, the American Heart Association or the journalist?
Mhm.
And, you know, most people are going to go with the American Heart Association. So it's an interesting problem.
So intermittent fasting's been gaining a lot of traction recently and in previous years, obviously. How does that align or conflict with your insulin-centric view of metabolism?
Well, one way you could look at intermittent fasting is a way of lowering insulin. So insulin goes up after eating, particularly after eating carbohydrates, also after eating protein, because 60% of the amino acids in the protein are converted into glucose in your liver, and then the insulin is secreted in response to that glucose. So I suspect that we evolved this insulin mechanism to deal with the protein in our diet because, for the most part, we didn't eat a lot of carbohydrates. Um, the Yeah, so it's quite possible intermittent fasting if it works. And again, it works in the short term. I don't tend to eat breakfast because I experimented with intermittent fasting and I found I felt better when I didn't eat. I had more energy and I lost a little weight I didn't think I needed to lose, although it all came back. Um, it's conceivable that it works by just lowering insulin for a longer period of time because you go a longer period of time that you're not eating. And when your insulin is low, you can mobilize fat from your fat tissue and burn it for fuel. So it increases the amount of time during the day that you're metabolizing fat instead of storing it.
Mhm.
That would be the explanation consistent with this carbohydrate insulin model.
Mhm. If you could give one piece of advice to someone struggling with weight or metabolic health, what would it be?
Don't eat sugar or drink it.
Mhm.
Stay away from sugar. That would be the first piece of advice. And then again, if we're right, the dietary trigger of the weight gain is the carbohydrate content of the diet. And so more or less rigid abstinence from the carbohydrates would be the solution. A metaphor I use in my book, The Case for Keto, is I had a corn allergy when I was young. So if I ate corn, um, I had gastrointestinal problems that I could have lived without. I like corn. I like corn on the cob. I like popcorn in movie theaters. Didn't matter. I was allergic to corn, so the solution was I don't eat corn. Nobody talked about, no doctor said, well, we're going to put you on a corn restricted diet, or we want you to count the corn calories you're eating. It's like you're allergic to corn, don't eat it. If this carbohydrate insulin model is right, those of us who gain weight easily, who struggle with our weight, cannot consume carbohydrates without storing excess fat. But you can have a perfectly healthy diet without eating them, just as I can have a perfectly healthy diet without eating corn. A little more being restricted. So more or less rigid abstinence to the carbohydrates in your diet. And that phrase, more or less rigid abstinence, comes from an 1825 book, so 200 years old this year, written by a Frenchman named Antoine Briat-Savarin. It was called The Physiology of Taste. It was the single most famous book ever written about food. Been in print for 200 years, and that was the advice Briat-Savarin gave back then. He said people get fat and obese, clearly do so because of the carbohydrates in the diet. He didn't use the term carbohydrates, and he said the solution is more or less rigid abstinence.
Mhm.
He also said that's what he did to keep his weight under control.
Mhm. So this question's a little unrelated to your work, except just from interest in terms of Peter Attia, which you said you knew. What do you think of his idea that muscle mass is so important to longevity? And do you view yourself at all as a longevity based, I don't know, scientist?
My issue with longevity research in general, think about it. So what you're establishing is that you have a hypothesis that, say, muscle mass will make you live longer. The more muscle mass you have, the longer you'll live. So the only way to test that hypothesis is in a randomized controlled trial where you compare, well, you can't compare people who have a lot of muscle mass to people who don't because they're different. So you have to start with a random population, randomize them into two groups, have one of them weight lift, then the other not, and see how long they live. And that experiment will never be done. So one of my issues with Peter's science after we stopped working together, we're still friends, I like to think, is you have these associations between things like muscle mass and longevity, VO2 max and longevity. So people who tend to be healthy longer tend to have more muscle mass. I'm assuming people they tend to have higher VO2 max. But again, it's the same problem, but they also tend to eat mostly plants. It's that same, you have an association between being healthy and having, significant muscle mass, having high VO2 max. Um, in a sense, you're defining healthy people as people who have that. But the hypothesis would be that you could make an unhealthy person healthy, a person who won't live very long, make them live longer by increasing their VO2 max or increasing their muscle mass. And we don't actually know if that's true. And it's quite possible in the process of doing that, you'll cause harm because any medical intervention causes harm. So, for instance, I've been an athlete my whole life. All my aches and pains in my late 60s are basically exercise induced. Now, we're not recommending people play football or box, which I did, or any of the other things that were responsible, but you do cause injuries by working out, by trying to increase your VO2 max. So, everything's a balance between the harm and the benefit. When you're suggesting an intervention will make you healthier and live longer, you have to worry about the harms as well as the benefits. And the only way to really know is to do a randomized control trial, to do experiments that the only variable you're changing is how much they're lifting or how much they're doing whatever they're doing to increase your VO2 max. I say VO2 max because I saw
Yeah.
Peter on 60 Minutes talking about it. And you don't know. So it makes sense. A lot of hypotheses make sense, but doesn't mean they're right. Like the sodium hypertension hypothesis made sense, but we've never been able to prove it's true. So that's my issue. The problem is if it sounds good, you can market it and you can make a lot of money and you can get people to buy into it. And at whatever age they die, you will never know whether or not they will never know, and you will never know whether or not you extended their life. The same issue exists for ketogenic diets, and I made this point in the case for keto. So I know that when people go on ketogenic diets, they get healthier because we have randomized controlled trials that show that over the course of a year or two. And if you do it yourself, you can actually experience getting healthy. You could experience the weight loss, you could experience having more energy, you could experience sleeping better. If you're depressed, there's even evidence now that it improves depression. So you can actually experience your symptoms resolving. If you have type 2 diabetes, you can go on one of these diets and realize that you don't need your diabetes drugs anymore, your hypertension drugs, because you can control your blood sugar without it. But we don't know if it'll make you live longer because we don't have that evidence. Because those require trials that basically you put people on diets and you follow them until the rest of their life to see how long they live. Um, so if I go on a ketogenic diet, one of the things that happens, I'm eating more red meat. Probably for me, I'm eating a lot of saturated fat because I like dairy and eggs. Um, let's say I live to be 90. I'm 69 now. Did I extend my life? We have no way of knowing. For all I know, had I continued to eat mostly plants like Michael Pollan, who lives about 3 miles from here, does, I assume, maybe I'd live to be 95. But maybe if I had continued to eat mostly plants, I'd have died at 85 or 80, or maybe I'd already be dead. There's no way to know. There's no counterfactual to study. So whenever you're getting into longevity, you're asking these questions that can't be answered. Even when you take a pill to prevent, like a statin to lower your LDL cholesterol, the clinical trials suggest that they make people live longer. Well, suggest that they reduce heart disease. And then the assumption is that they live longer because you're reducing heart disease. But if I go on a statin to control and again, if I die at 90, did I live longer because I took the drug? We have no way to know. If I die tomorrow because I didn't take the drug, is that because I didn't take the drug? Or would I have died tomorrow anyway? Even, there's just all these questions you can't answer. So you do randomized controlled trials, but when you're looking at longevity, those trials don't exist. So
Mhm.
you're basically selling your intuition. Peter's intuition is very good, but if he's honest, he's acknowledging that that's what he's doing, not that this is some science, that the rigorous science supports the intuition.
Mhm. So lastly, we ask all of our interviewees the same question, which is how do you define success personally and professionally?
Because I have kids your age, it's a question that bothers me. Getting to do something with your life that's important to you and others and challenging and ideally enjoyable as well. If it pays well, great.
Mhm.
But there's a trade-off between what really, doing really interesting work and challenging work. And in saying this, I could be justifying my life, remember, because I have to justify why you're talking to me. And that's how I justify what I did. It was interesting, it was challenging. It was kept me intellectually curious, wasn't easy. So every day can be difficult. But I think I'm making a difference for people, so that also matters. That's also part of success.